Recorded music industry revenues OC original content. Here comes the sun, streaming saves a battered music industry. Interesting. What's the gray stuff below everything? What about revenue on concerts? Other includes things like sync rights, background music for a commercial, music videos and other niche formats. You joke, but to me this is the absolute height of irony. When that song came out and MTV was taking over, it really did seem that radio was dead. Now Spotify is basically paid radio coming over Wi-Fi and cellular radio waves, and MTV is nothing but freak shows and reality soap operas for teens. Well, yes, the Buggles said video killed the radio star, but then Queen countered it with radio GAGA, and since Queen is more powerful than the Buggles, video could not in fact kill the radio star. Not really. The Buggles were mainly Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes. They both joined Yes for the drama album. Neither was in Yes for Owner of a Lonely Heart, primarily written by Trevor Rabin. Horn did produce the album though. Downes went on to form Asia with John Wetton, Carl Palmer, and Steve Howe. Not to mention radio stars like Rush Limbaugh, Howard Stern, and George Norrie still exist. Video may not have killed the radio star, but all it left in its wake were twisted mutants. Those guys are getting up in their years. I wonder how long this age of radio will last. This is a comparison of recorded music revenues, so live concerts don't really fit with the data set, but it would be interesting to see. I've also been under the impression that most concert revenue goes directly to the performer, and less towards the record company, so it may not be wholly appropriate to consider concerts in this set. And from concerts in general. That's how I rationalized pirating music in late 2000s, early 2010s. I was really into the indie rock scene, those people toured a lot, and I'd eventually see almost all the bands that I liked. My friend was in a moderately successful band in the early 2000s. He actually used to message people he found sharing his band's music, pretending to be just a fellow fan, and tell people that the band sounded good on CD, or MP3, but were awesome live and that they should go see them. This is only recording revenue. I assume touring and events definitely isn't included, as it's a huge industry that's only grown in recent decades. For huge artists, yes. For smaller artists trying to make their way up, and even some moderately successful indie artists, touring often costs instead of pays and is not sustainable. Touring is very expensive unless you're already huge and everything is guaranteed. This is probably about right. I know it isn't it in the source data, taking into account that way fewer musicians got to the point of having a recorded album and published, so few people made a killing from music, but nowhere near what they earned the labels. Now everyone and their dog can record, mix, master and publish, but they all take a significantly thinner cut of the small piece of pie that ever went to the artists. So internet killed the music industry, good riddance, but it also destroyed the revenue for major and independent artists alike, not so good. And the people making actual obscene money are the internet bubble unicorns like in every other area. I too was curious about concert revenues and merchandise. Those certainly being my favorite ways of supporting artists. The chart is incomplete without that data. Anecdotally, what I've heard is that most bands are in the clothing business rather than the music business when you look at their income streams. Concert revenue is completely separate from the music industry, as it's called, because record companies/radio stations have never made much money off of them. A lot of artists, especially now, have always relied on touring revenue and merch sales for the bulk of their income, but the industry as a whole, the suits, have never really factored in live shows into the idea of the declining music industry, if you will. What caused the big dip leading up to the early 80s? Was it cassette piracy, which then dies out due to CDs? Or something else? This chart is also slightly misleading. Physical sales meant more money for artists. Streams do not help artists sign to labels at all besides recoupment on their record deal. Spotify pays about 0.004 cents USD per stream, and a record label takes about 90% of that. Since the dawn of streaming, live touring has been the main source of income for artists that don't own the masters to their music, aka pretty much literally everyone, because record labels take ownership of masters. While the revenue in the industry is indeed rising, the amount going to artists is vastly less. I only got a ringtone via SMS once. I thought it was a full song, but it was like a few seconds. Good old days. Kind of miss those shitty phone ads selling you games and music. I bet they didn't really own half of the stuff they were selling, at least here. No one cared about here anyway. Anyone old enough to remember monophonic ringtones? You could make your own by punching in a list of numbers that would correspond to a particular pitch and duration. You could actually find the codes for different songs online and enter them in by hand, then do it 4 more times until you didn't have any mistakes. Haha, I totally forgot about those. I only purchased one ringtone ever, Kids by Management, and had that shit for years. Best ringtone ever, and sometimes I wouldn't answer the call just to listen to it. Great choice. That's why we originally rooted Android. Ringtones accepting custom MIDIs, then waves, then folders could be moved on some phones and MP3s, and the native laxing of that in the OS over time as our attention moved to other features and fees. From what I understand, that was when they started tracking per LP. Prior to that, they only tracked airplay on single songs to calculate royalties. Album sales were tracked as artist units, as most artists had lifetime contracts back then, and they just wanted to know if they sold more Sinatra records in a year, if he made more records, i.e. new album releases were marketed to draw attention to that artist's entire back catalog. It's also partially the reason musical genres stagnated and languished for decades and then exploded in the 1970s. American rock and roll in the 1950s and the British rock invasion of the 1960s are other major factors. There is a lot out there to be read about the history of the music industry. Edit. I wasn't clear enough with the decades thing and how the industry vehicle contributed to consumer demand. Pre-1950s, mostly live performances on AM radio, live concerts in big cities, LP sales, varying lengths. 1950s, pre-recorded AM radio, 45s, jukeboxes, 45s, live concert tours to more cities, 45s, and LPs at home. Really the golden age of the single as we know it. Until streaming. 1960s, the Grateful Dead invent the wall of sound high wattage concert PA system, and stadium concerts/festivals invented overnight. All of a sudden millions of kids were being exposed to entire albums worth of music from one band, which is how the blues rock bands competed with one another. This would begin the rock LP era. 1970s, FM radio started playing albums in their entirety. 8-track cassettes allowed people to bring their LPs with them in the car for the first time. Massive explosion in musical genres which continues today. 1980s, cassettes and the Walkman now made portable music ubiquitous. Focus still on LPs because it was still inconvenient to have more than a couple tapes on you at a time. CDs and beyond are well documented recent history, but that should shed some light on how music itself changes with the industry marketing and production vehicle. I.e. rock music didn't die in the 2010s at all, but streaming services massively reinforce the single song release, where rock-oriented bands still release their product in 1960s album form and we still gobble it up. Recent releases by Tool, Foo Fighters, Queens of the Stone Age, Metallica etc. by drawing massive interest in their albums every X number of years. Their music didn't go out of style at all, the industry moved away from their preferred delivery model. The Dead introduced the wall of sound in 1974. Before that, they worked with Owsley to create better, more state-of-the-art sound systems, but nothing like the wall of sound until some small trial runs in 1973. The full wall was first seen in February 1974. My grandfather used to tell me how he'd line up to buy Elvis records on the day of release. This was the 1950s. I believe it was fairly common then to buy albums. Very interesting, thank you. I would love to see a comparison that included sheet music, which is sort of the precursor to LPS IMO, but only a historian would be able to add that in. It was a huge industry at the beginning of the 20th century until most people were able to purchase home record players. In case you haven't already listened to it, I'll recommend it. The SYSK podcast did an episode on the famous Tin Pan Alley that kind of delves into your curiosities a bit. Small correction, pre-1950s there were no LPS, it was all 78s. And people were buying LPS in the 1980s because they sounded better, availability was better, and you got random access. LPS were around before the 50s, unveiled by Columbia in 1948. By 1952, 78s were still about half of all records sold, but LPS were 17% of unit sales, 26% of dollar sales. You could make an argument LPS sound better than CDs today. Especially if the LP was created from original source. Back in 1989, I swore up and down my turntable sounded better than my brand new CD player, especially with my upgraded DJ quality Shure cartridge. Now I know for certain it did. Early CD players weren't all that. It was all marketing bullshit. My problem with anyone who says rock music never died or has made a return is that the artists mentioned as examples are usually artists who were already established in the 90s/early 2000s. CDs and beyond are well documented recent history, but that should shed some light on how music itself changes with the industry marketing and production vehicle. Cool. I had very few records as a kid, more tapes, than a million CDs. A couple girls freshman year put a whole library of pop music on my PC when they found out I had none. Then it was CD cases for years. Put it all on an iPod, traded that for an iPhone, then Apple Music came and ruined it. Shit I owned on CD would just disappear from my library. Not that I knew where the CDs were anymore. That was super disheartening. Pandora was great for discovering new music. But Spotify is where it's at, now. One thing to note, around the same time as Napster, there was a massive class action lawsuit against major music labels for price-fixing CDs. I was in college and managing a university computer lab when Napster came out, and I got to explore so much music with that download speed. In the era of vinyl and even into cassettes, consumers wanted a whole quality product because we'd just put on the album and listen to the whole thing. But with CDs we could skip tracks, which treated the album as more of a collection of singles. Record companies took advantage of that by pushing 9 to 14 terrible factory-produced songs from their slush pile onto an album with 1 to 2 popular singles. They charged $15 to $20 for a product that had maybe 10% of content anyone intended on using. When consumers complained that we now had to shuffle lots of CDs just to get a decent playlist, because burners weren't common or cheap, they introduced expensive CD changers that took up the car's trunk. So before a trip we'd have to load up 5 CDs that held the 10 songs we wanted to listen to and the 70 we didn't, and skip incessantly. Artists not being pushed by a major label often found their work shoved in a drawer because it didn't fit marketing plans at some chain record store like Sam Goody. Artists had no label control over what they performed, what songs were on their CDs, no direct communications with fans, the label even controlled whether they performed or not. Get out of line or object to this bullshit and the artist wasn't allowed to perform or get radio play. Labels destroyed careers over control all the time. TLC, the artists, made, edit, $50,000 each off the album with waterfalls due to how tightly the label controlled all negotiations. Cassettes and vinyl could be pressed/made by artists themselves. They were easier for small labels. Chris Ledoux made a mainstream career and became a legend by selling cassettes in a parking lot. Impossible under CDs then. Napster reminded us that the CD industry was bullshit and enlightened a lot of us that corporate music had become unacceptably narrow. Napster raised our standards for good music and quality product. Now that we finally had access to it, we realized just how many artists got shut out. Lots of groups would record and upload their own content. Artists in disputes with their labels would leak content to Napster that their label tried to suppress. That's why the RIA killed it and were so late to the game with digital. They were losing control over the consumer and over the artistic human beings they viewed as product. And then iTunes responded to the market by allowing you to buy individual songs off each album. It was $0.99 for each song, but $1.30 for each popular song. Even up to a few bucks for top hit songs. I was pretty young when Napster started, but I definitely remember there being a massive sentiment of fuck the music industry, which helped music piracy get so mainstream. They didn't help themselves by taking more and more of their artists' revenue as piracy took off either. It basically became, do I want to give none of my money to the artists I listen to, or do I want to pay $20 to give them a few cents? I forget who said it, maybe Ice Cube. Anyway, when Napster was crushing and the industry was in a huff and getting ready to sue it into oblivion, he was like, I'm pretty sure Napster isn't popular because people want to steal music, it's popular because they don't want to pay $21 for a CD full of crap to get the one song they want to listen to. I really believe it was never about the theft/freeness of Napster and torrents and all that, not at the heart of it. It was just easier, and the music industry as a whole was not providing a service that clearly had huge market demand. Then Apple was just like, LOL, okay, we will just do it then. Here's iPods and here's iTunes, and just ate everyone's lunch. I think the resurgence of vinyl has shown he was right. I absolutely love buying albums from artists I love. Partially. I was in uni when Napster surfaced and part of it was absolutely sticking it to the man. But also CDs were expensive and we simply didn't have more money. Napster and its followers, Audacity, also allowed to explore genres that weren't well represented in general record stores. The big names were okay to get, but it could be hard even to buy Dark Side of the Moon. Online shopping wasn't a thing yet and most of the people working in those stores weren't really helpful. That said, I still bought CDs of the bands I was really a fan of. I was a teenager when Napster, and Kazaa and LimeWire, happened and it was 100% holy shit, you can get almost any song for free. The stuff you're saying about the industry is correct, but I don't think it figured in the motivations of the vast majority of Napster users. Like, I lived in Scandinavia and getting the music you wanted was just stupid hard or even impossible sometimes. The music industry just played itself when it came to distribution. Yet I remember being a kid with a $5 monthly allowance. It wasn't about fuck the system, it was I want more music. But the reason being able to get almost any song for free was so exciting was because of how expensive it was to actually control what you listen to. These days we're spoiled with being able to find basically any song on YouTube or Spotify for free or $5/month for no ads. However, in 1999 your only options were music videos on MTV, the handful of songs on the radio, or you had to buy a full album for $20, which is the equivalent of $31 after adjusting for inflation. And that album you bought was a gamble, because you likely could only hear the main hit before buying it. A single album was more expensive than 6 months of Spotify. So it wasn't the fact that it was free, it was because hearing whatever music you wanted to was essentially unaffordable for most people before then. When I was in high school that shit was everywhere. Magazine pages full of codes with corresponding songs. Text Jumbo plus code to 6464 and receive your ringtone. They even had subscription services for like $5 a week where you'd get a new ringtone every few days. When I got my first cell phone, one of the first things I did was figure out how I could connect my phone to my computer and put my own ringtone on it so I didn't have to buy them. While I really appreciate the sound of vinyl, an artist getting paid, and owning my own music, so songs I like don't suddenly disappear from my collection, and cover art. Man, I really don't miss lugging my huge vinyl collection around every time I move, or having to dust it, or find shelves strong enough, or worry about heat and humidity. I still have a small stack of records, Ones I couldn't replace with CDs, roughly 2 feet high if you stack them vertically. That's still only some pitiful number of albums. Would be cool to see revenue for the artist on this graph, then you could see the huge rip-off by the record companies. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and comment Reddit Story Time for more Reddit stories.